June 1944. A captured airfield somewhere inside Germany. Leutnant Walter Wolfrum is 21 years old. He holds the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. He has scored more than 100 confirmed aerial victories. He has been wounded 4 times, shot down, and crash-landed a dozen times. The scar tissue across his right hand healed badly in a field hospital that had neither the time nor the supplies to do better. By every measurable standard available to the Luftwaffe, he is one of the most dangerous fighter pilots alive on the planet that summer. He walks across the tarmac toward an aircraft finished in silver skin and painted with German crosses. His hands are steady, the way they have stayed steady through 4 wounds and a dozen forced landings. This is not combat. He has not been scrambled. He has been summoned, personally, by Luftwaffe High Command to evaluate the machine sitting in front of him, a North American P-51 Mustang, the American fighter that had begun appearing over the Reich in numbers climbing week over week, killing Germany's most experienced pilots faster than the Luftwaffe's own leadership could publicly acknowledge. His superiors want a professional answer. What makes this aircraft so lethal? Where does it fail? How does a German pilot survive an encounter with one? Wolfram climbs into the cockpit. What he finds over the following hours will unsettle Luftwaffe High Command more thoroughly than any single tactical report of the entire war. His written evaluation travels up through the chain of command. Generals read it, operations staffs analyze it, and the institutional reaction is not tactical recalculation. It is something closer to quiet despair. Because what Wolfram reported was never really about one airplane. It was about a deeper gap between 2 industrial civilizations that no amount of German pilot skill, however extraordinary, could close by itself. And once his superiors absorbed what he was actually telling them, expressed not just in the report's technical language, but in what a frontline ace had felt sitting in that cockpit, they understood something the institution had spent the better part of a year refusing to accept. They were no longer losing a battle. They were losing the war. To understand what Wolfram found, and why his own written phrase would sit uneasily in German Air Command's institutional memory for the rest of the conflict, requires going back, not merely to the start of the air war over Europe, but to the moment German commanders looked at America's earliest, bloodiest disasters in the skies over the Reich and mistook catastrophe for confirmation. They were wrong, in a way that would prove both catastrophic and permanent, and the bill came due in a borrowed cockpit in the summer of 1944. By 1943, the United States Army Air Forces was absorbing losses over Germany at a rate that, on paper, should have ended the entire strategic bombing campaign outright. Picture what unescorted daylight bombing actually meant from inside a B-17 Flying Fortress. 27,000 feet, 50 degrees below zero outside the aircraft, cabin heaters that worked intermittently at best, an oxygen mask that fogged with every breath, electrically heated gloves that cycled on and off unpredictably. The mission itself was, on paper, straightforward. Fly roughly 600 miles into the heart of Germany, release the bombs, fly home. The execution was catastrophic, because between the bomber crews and their targets waited Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s that were not scrambling in urgent response. They were waiting, with the calculated patience of pilots who understood precisely how much flying time the enemy actually had. The specific trap the Luftwaffe had engineered by mid-1943 was, in its own narrow terms, elegant. American escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, twin-boomed P-38 Lightnings, could protect the bomber streams only as far as roughly the German border, some 250 miles from the English coast. Beyond that line, the B-17s and B-24s flew entirely alone, and Luftwaffe operations staff had mapped the exact geography of that limit down to the kilometer. German fighters simply positioned themselves beyond it, out of reach of the escorts, and waited for the bombers to cross into what had effectively become a permanent killing zone. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched its most ambitious operation to date. 376 B-17s in 2 combined streams, one aimed at the Messerschmitt production complex at Regensburg, the other at the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The underlying theory was elegant on paper. Ball bearings sat inside nearly every piece of German military machinery, every tank, aircraft, artillery piece, and submarine engine, and destroying the supply should, in principle, seize the entire war machine like an engine starved of oil. 60 B-17s were lost across both raids that single day. Roughly 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. The Schweinfurt factories were damaged but not destroyed, and German production was substantially restored within weeks. The Americans returned to Schweinfurt on October 14th with 291 bombers. This time, 60 aircraft were lost outright, another 17 damaged beyond repair, and roughly 650 airmen gone. The date entered the official American record simply as Black Thursday. Look at the arithmetic facing any individual crew. A combat tour ran 25 missions, and on a raid carrying Schweinfurt's loss rate, close to 20%, that tour was not, in any meaningful statistical sense, survivable across its full length. Second Lieutenant Harold Stern, a 22-year-old bombardier from Akron, Ohio, flying with the 381st Bomb Group aboard a B-17 named Lead Banana, survived the October 14th mission and later wrote that somewhere across the 5 unescorted hours over enemy territory, watching German fighters attack in successive waves, he had made his own private peace with dying. He was no longer frightened in his own account. He was simply waiting. He completed his tour. A considerable number of the men who had trained alongside him did not. Luftwaffe leadership, General Adolf Galland, commander of the fighter arm, chief among them, studied these numbers and reached a conclusion that read, at the time, as entirely reasonable. The Americans could not sustain losses at this rate indefinitely. Unescorted strategic bombing had, for all practical purposes, been proven a failure, and the Reich's industrial heartland remained beyond America's genuine reach. German fighter production continued climbing even as Allied bombers pounded German cities in return. The escort problem itself was, in Galland's own professional assessment, unsolvable. Physics itself seemed to forbid combining the fuel range needed to reach deep into Germany with the aerodynamic performance needed to win a fight once you arrived there. British aeronautical scientists broadly agreed with this assessment. No escort fighter carrying the fuel to cross Germany could remain maneuverable enough, once it got there, to reliably protect a bomber stream. Stable was the word German assessments kept returning to describe the overall strategic situation. That single word, in retrospect, stands as one of the more expensive miscalculations in the entire history of aerial warfare. Something German intelligence had noticed, without correctly weighing its significance, was already underway in England. The P-51 Mustang had existed for several years by this point and had begun its operational life as a distinctly unremarkable aircraft. Its original Allison-engined version flew adequately at low altitude but grew sluggish and underpowered at height. The British, who had originally ordered it, found the type underwhelming for genuine air combat and relegated it largely to reconnaissance and low-level tactical work. Nothing in its early service record suggested it would eventually become the instrument of the Luftwaffe's institutional destruction. In 1942, someone proposed fitting the existing Mustang airframe with a different engine entirely, the British Rolls-Royce Merlin. The combination produced one of those rare moments in aviation engineering when two individually ordinary components, joined together, become something considerably greater than either. The Mustang airframe was lightweight, aerodynamically refined, and exceptionally low drag. The Merlin was powerful, mechanically reliable, and fitted with a two-stage supercharger that sustained its power output at altitudes where comparable German engines had already begun to fade. Together, the two components produced a machine neither Britain nor the United States could plausibly have built entirely on its own. Britain supplying the engine, America the airframe, neither country initially grasping the full scale of what the pairing would ultimately produce. German intelligence had observed the new Mustangs beginning to appear over England and understood, in general terms, that something had changed. They had not yet grasped its actual scale. They remained confident, still waiting patiently beyond their carefully mapped escort line, that the underlying physics of fuel and range still protected them. They were about to discover that the line itself no longer existed, and one German pilot would discover this on the ground, in a borrowed cockpit, before the rest of the Luftwaffe discovered it in the sky. Walter Wolfram was born May 23, 1923, in the small Bavarian town of Schwabach. He volunteered for the Luftwaffe in October 1940 at 17 years old, trained first on the Focke-Wulf 44 biplane and then on the Messerschmitt Bf 109F, and was posted in February 1943 to a unit operating in Crimea, Jagdgeschwader 52, universally known within the Luftwaffe simply as JG-52. If the name means nothing to you, here is the relevant context. JG-52 stands, by any reasonable statistical measure, as the most successful fighter wing in the recorded history of aerial combat. Not merely among Axis air forces, but across every air force that has ever fought a war. Its pilots claimed more than 10,000 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed across the unit's operational history. The three highest-scoring fighter aces ever recorded, Erich Hartmann with 352 victories, Gerhard Barkhorn with 301, Günther Rall with 275, all wore JG-52's insignia. This was the unit a 19-year-old from a small Bavarian town joined in the spring of 1943, and nobody around him particularly expected him to last. The Eastern Front that year was a genuine furnace. Soviet forces had rebuilt substantially since the catastrophic losses of 1941. The new Yak-9 and LA-5FN fighters were capable machines, able to fight a Bf-109G on close to equal terms under the right conditions, and Soviet pilots were improving steadily, their numbers growing week by week against a German replacement pipeline that could not keep equivalent pace. Wolfram flew his first operational missions over the Crimean bridgehead in March 1943, and did not score his first confirmed kill until June. Roughly 60 missions of watching, learning, and simply surviving before that first success arrived. In an air war where some pilots scored on their very first flight, and others never scored at all. Wolfram was, by every surviving account, methodical rather than flashy. He studied his opponents carefully and flew with enough caution to stay alive, while the war itself gradually educated him. By April 1944, he had accumulated 70 confirmed victories. Then, on May 30th, over the Ploiești oil fields in Romania, with Soviet forces pressing hard from the north and the German defensive line under severe strain, Wolfram claimed 11 aerial victories in a single day. The Luftwaffe maintained a formal internal designation for this kind of performance. A pilot who scored 5 or more victories in one day was an ace in a day. 10 or more made him a double ace in a day, an extraordinarily rare distinction. Wolfram achieved it on May 30th, and again on July 16th, claiming 10 victories near Kamianka, northeast of Lviv. On June 1, 1944, he was formally credited with his 100th confirmed aerial victory, the 74th Luftwaffe pilot to reach that specific milestone at 21 years old. This is the man Luftwaffe High Command specifically selected to evaluate its most pressing aerial threat. Not a desk officer, not a test pilot who had spent the war safely removed from combat at a research center far from the front. A frontline killer who had survived being shot down and crash-landed a dozen times, wounded 4 times, and who understood in a way no engineer reading a specification sheet ever could exactly what actually mattered to a man someone else was actively trying to kill at 20,000 feet. Before Wolfram could climb into that specific cockpit, though, someone first had to put the airplane in front of him. And the story of precisely how a captured American fighter came to sit on a German airfield wearing German crosses is itself one of the stranger intelligence operations of the entire war. In 1943, a Luftwaffe officer named Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius received one of the more unusual assignments issued anywhere in the wartime German military. Form a dedicated unit whose sole purpose was collecting crashed and force-landed Allied aircraft, restoring them to flying condition, and touring them across German airfields so frontline pilots could directly experience the particular strengths and weaknesses of the machines they were already fighting against in combat. The unit's formal designation was the 2nd Staffel of the Versuchsverband Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, the Luftwaffe High Command Trial Squadron. Almost nobody used that name. Every pilot in the Luftwaffe simply called it the Circus Rosarius, the Rosarius Circus. A traveling exhibition of enemy machines moving from airfield to airfield with a single implicit message. This is what is killing you, now understand why. The circus collected essentially everything it could recover intact. Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, Supermarine Spitfires, de Havilland Mosquitoes, Hawker Typhoons, and eventually the one prize the Luftwaffe most urgently wanted to understand: the North American P-51 Mustang. To prevent German anti-aircraft crews from mistaking a captured aircraft for a genuine American intruder and shooting it down over friendly territory, an entirely reasonable operational concern, every captured aircraft in the circus's inventory received a distinctive paint scheme: bright yellow undersides, yellow tail sections, yellow engine cowlings, each carrying the Circus's own aircraft code, T9. One captured P-51B received the designation T9 plus HK. Its identity survives in full. Serial number 43-24825, nicknamed Jersey Jerk, originally assigned to Lieutenant Thomas Fraser of the 4th Fighter Group's 334th Squadron, lost in combat near Cambrai, France on June 6, 1944. Recovered by German forces, repaired, and transferred directly into the Circus's rotation. The aircraft toured airfield to airfield. Experienced German pilots, men who had already fought the Mustang over Germany and survived the encounter, were invited to walk around it on the ground, sit in its cockpit, understand precisely what an American pilot could and could not see from that seat, feel the controls under their own hands, and finally ask, directly rather than in the abstract, the question they had been fighting past for months without a satisfying answer. Why does this aircraft keep winning? Selected aces were permitted to fly it. Walter Wolfram was one of them. He accepted the invitation, flew the evaluation, and wrote his report. And the first observation in that report caught Luftwaffe High Command entirely off guard, because it addressed neither speed, nor firepower, nor altitude performance, nor turning radius. The first thing Wolfram noticed was the cockpit itself. The P-51's cockpit was, by his own account, enormous. After more than 1,000 hours accumulated in the Messerschmitt Bf-109, stepping into the Mustang felt, in his own later description, close to entering an entirely different country. In the 109, a pilot's shoulders pressed directly against the fuselage walls. The engine-mounted 20mm cannon sat between his knees. Every control sat within immediate finger reach in every direction. Tight, compressed, shaped tightly around the pilot's own body, engineered above all else for raw performance rather than physical comfort. The P-51 felt entirely different. Its seat sat lower. Its instrument panel spread noticeably wider. Its controls felt, by comparison, physically distant. The bubble canopy fitted to production Mustangs by mid-1944 gave a full 360-degree field of view no Bf-109 or Focke-Wulf 190 pilot could match. An American pilot could see behind, below, and to every side simultaneously, where a German pilot checking his own tail had to physically crane his neck and simply hope. Wolfram later described the sensation with unusual precision. He had, during the war, had the opportunity to fly both captured P-47s and P-51s. He had not particularly liked the Thunderbolt, too large, its cockpit immense and unfamiliar, everything feeling out of reach after so many hours confined inside the tight, familiar shape of the 109. Then he added one sentence his superiors had not been prepared for. Although the P-51 was, because of its handling and capabilities, a fine airplane to fly, it too was disconcerting. A fine airplane, from a pilot with 100 confirmed victories, an Eastern Front killer, a double ace in a day, a man who had survived 4 wounds and a dozen forced landings. This was not a polite courtesy extended to a defeated enemy's engineering. It was a professional verdict, delivered by someone who had earned the standing to render one. Wolfram was not claiming the Mustang outperformed the 109 across every measurable category, and he was certainly not suggesting German pilots could no longer shoot Mustangs down. He was stating, in the plain vocabulary of a working professional rather than a propagandist, that it was well built and needed to be taken seriously. In the summer of 1944, inside an institution still publicly insisting the strategic air war remained winnable, a fine airplane landed on Luftwaffe High Command with the weight of a diagnosis nobody in the room particularly wanted delivered. The cockpit was only the opening section of the report. When Wolfram pushed the throttle forward and the engine caught, he felt something that reshaped his own working sense of what an aircraft could be. The engine was a Packard-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650, a liquid-cooled V12 producing roughly 1,490 horsepower at standard combat settings, with meaningfully higher output available through water methanol injection when needed. Its 2-speed, 2-stage supercharger sustained power output at altitudes where the Daimler-Benz DB605 fitted to the Bf-109G had already begun visibly fading. The supercharger engaged automatically at the correct altitude with no pilot input required at all. The fuel mixture adjusted itself continuously. The aircraft simply produced the power it was designed to produce, consistently, regardless of altitude, temperature, or whether the pilot was climbing, diving, or turning hard. But the specific detail Wolfram recorded that stopped his superiors cold, reading the report afterward, was smaller and considerably more mundane. There were no oil leaks. Consider precisely what that single observation meant to a pilot who had spent 14 continuous months fighting across the Eastern Front, Russian winters where the temperature fell to 40 degrees below zero, where German ground crews worked in pitch darkness before 4 in the morning with hands cracked open from cold, physically hand-cranking an inertia starter flywheel until it stored enough rotational energy to turn an engine over at all, where oil viscosity itself became a routine daily crisis, where a seal that had sealed perfectly well in September routinely failed by December, where a single oil leak developing at altitude could mean a forced landing on Soviet-held ground with everything that outcome implied for a captured German pilot's chances of survival. An engine that simply did not leak. An engine that started reliably at the press of a single electrical switch. This was not, in the narrow sense, combat performance data at all. It was logistics. And by mid-1944, logistics had become the actual margin separating a Luftwaffe pilot who survived an engagement from one who did not. Wolfram was not alone in this specific observation. Günther Rall, 275 confirmed victories, the third highest scoring fighter ace in recorded aviation history, already a legend at 26, also flew the captured Mustangs through the same Circus Rosarius program, and was equally candid in later interviews about exactly what he found. He described a favorable impression of the aircraft, and specifically identified the engine as the real difference. Across roughly 300 hours logged in captured P-51s, there was, in his own words, no oil leak, which he called simply fantastic. And he found himself specifically fascinated by the electrical starting switch, a feature German aircraft of the period entirely lacked, which had made starting engines in the Russian winter reliably difficult across the entire war. The third highest scoring fighter ace in the recorded history of aerial combat, reflecting on what actually decided the air war, was talking about electric starter motors and oil seals rather than gunnery or dogfighting geometry. Because what he was really describing was the accumulated gap in industrial quality control between the two factories building these two machines. American production was turning out P-51s at a rate exceeding 100 aircraft a week by early 1944. Each one precisely machined, each one functionally identical to the one before it, carrying the accumulated quality discipline of an industrial system that had been running at sustained full output for close to 2 years, not scrambling under active bombing, not substituting inferior materials, not tightening manufacturing tolerances because the original supplier's depot had become a bomb crater. The Mustang simply worked, reliably, every time, and that reliability cascaded through the entire war in ways no single engagement statistic ever captured directly. A German pilot who could not get his own engine started in the cold lost precious minutes on the ground, while the American formation passed overhead unmolested. A German aircraft with an ailing fuel pump or a fouled spark plug mid-mission had to break off early or risk outright engine failure at 25,000 feet. A German ground crew burning 3 hours on a maintenance fix that should have taken 30 minutes left one fewer aircraft available for the next scramble. Multiply this pattern across thousands of aircraft, across hundreds of missions, across 2 years of steadily deteriorating German production conditions running directly against 2 years of steadily improving American ones, and the resulting gap was not, in any meaningful sense, a gap in pilot skill or aircraft design philosophy. It was a gap between two entire industrial civilizations. One further finding in Wolfram's evaluation made nearly everything else feel secondary by comparison. He climbed higher, opened the throttle further, and felt how the aircraft moved through the air at real altitude, and understood, in his own body, something the Mustang's own designers had only partially grasped when they originally built it: the wing. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, had built the P-51 around a laminar flow wing developed in direct cooperation with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the NACA. The airfoil, drawn from the NACA's 45-100 series, was shaped to maintain smooth, orderly airflow across a considerably greater proportion of the wing's surface before turbulence set in, a design promising, in theoretical terms, a substantial reduction in overall drag compared to conventional wing profiles. In practical service, the actual gains proved real but more modest than the theory suggested. Manufacturing imperfections, rain, insect residue, and combat damage all disrupted true laminar flow on any given operational sortie. But there was a secondary property nobody had fully anticipated when the wing was originally designed. By pure engineering serendipity, the same airfoil shape that reduced low-speed drag also happened to reduce drag substantially at high Mach numbers. The P-51 possessed what aeronautical engineers would later term a transonic-capable wing. Its critical Mach number, the speed at which compressibility effects began producing dangerous handling problems, sat measurably higher than the Bf-109s, higher than the Focke-Wulf 190s, higher than any other fighter the Luftwaffe fielded against it. In a genuine high-speed dive, with both aircraft pushed to the practical limits of their respective airframes, the American pilot retained full control, while his German counterpart felt his own control stiffening, his aircraft buffeting, his elevator authority fading away. The standard German response to compressibility onset was simple: break off the dive early, concede the engagement. The American response was to keep diving, keep pulling, and stay in the fight. A raw advantage in firepower could, in principle, eventually be closed through better tactics. An advantage in individual pilot maneuverability could be offset through superior skill. An advantage baked directly into a wing's own underlying aerodynamics, present invisibly in every dive, every zoom climb, every sustained high-speed turn at altitude, was structural, and no amount of individual German pilot talent could simply fly around it. Wolfram, though, had saved his most unsettling finding for last. Not the cockpit, not the engine, not even the wing, but the single factor all three combined to produce. Something with no individual component a German engineer could plausibly copy, reverse engineer, or incrementally improve upon. What actually finished the Luftwaffe was not raw aircraft performance at all. It was endurance. Picture the specific position of a German fighter pilot in early 1944. By any objective measure, you rank among the finest fighter pilots in the world. You carry more accumulated combat hours than your American opponent. Your own aircraft turns tighter at low speed, hits harder with its 20mm cannon, and climbs at an angle that can carry you clear of trouble faster than a Mustang can realistically follow. You know the sky over Germany the way you know your own reflection. And you have, in total, roughly 90 minutes of fuel. 90 minutes to take off, climb to intercept altitude, locate the bomber formation, fight, disengage, and return to base. Every hard turn you executed, every burst of cannon fire, every additional minute spent actively hunting, bled directly against that same fixed clock. Ground controllers tracked the remaining margin continuously, and at some point the recall order came through, regardless of how the engagement itself was going. You did not argue with it. You went home. A P-51D fitted with two 108-gallon external drop tanks could remain airborne for more than 7 hours. Günther Rall, reflecting after the war on his own time flying the captured Mustangs through the Circus Rosarius program, delivered what may stand as the single most candid assessment any German pilot of this war ever committed to record. He considered the Mustang, on balance, the best fighter of the entire conflict. The Spitfire, in his assessment, was excellent, but lacked the Mustang's endurance, and that difference, in his own final judgment, was the decisive factor of the entire air war. American pilots flew for 7 hours. German pilots flew for 1 hour and 20 minutes. In his own words, that made quite a considerable difference in aerial combat. 1 hour 20 minutes against 7 hours was never merely a tactical inconvenience. It was a strategic death sentence, because a pilot who can remain airborne that long no longer needs to simply protect the bombers he is escorting. He can actively hunt. In January 1944, Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, the same officer who had led the famous 1942 low-level raid on Tokyo, now commanding the 8th Air Force, visited 8th Fighter Command Headquarters and noticed a sign posted on the wall stating that the first duty of 8th Air Force fighters was to bring the bombers home alive. He ordered it removed. Its replacement read that the first duty of 8th Air Force fighters was to destroy German fighters outright. Doolittle would later describe this single decision as the most consequential he made across the entire war. American fighters were formally released from close escort duty. Entire fighter groups now ranged 50 miles ahead of the bomber formations, sweeping the sky clear of German interceptors well before they could organize a coordinated attack run. When German fighters did gather to attack, American Mustangs were frequently already positioned above and behind them, waiting. After the bombers struck their targets, American fighters swept back across German airspace on the return leg, strafing airfields and pursuing anything still moving on the ground. On March 4, 1944, P-51Bs of the 4th Fighter Group, led by Colonel Donald Blakesley, escorted 8th Air Force bombers all the way to Berlin, a round trip of roughly 1,100 miles, and arrived over the German capital with genuine fuel to spare. When word reached Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that American fighters were circling directly over Berlin, he reportedly remarked that he knew right then the war was effectively lost. Göring had spent much of the war publicly dismissing American aviation entirely, having reportedly assured Hitler that American factories built automobiles and refrigerators rather than serious warplanes, and had personally guaranteed the German public that the skies over the Reich remained impenetrable. American fighter pilots were now circling his own capital at will, with enough remaining fuel to strafe targets on the way home. The part of this account that receives less attention than it deserves is that the Luftwaffe's actual destruction was never primarily a matter of aircraft shot down at all. Germany in 1944 produced more aircraft than in any previous year of the entire war. Albert Speer's armaments reforms, the dispersal of production across smaller facilities, and the extensive use of forced labor kept German factories running despite sustained strategic bombing, turning out more than 35,000 aircraft that year alone, comfortably enough to replace combat losses in raw numerical terms. An aircraft could be replaced in roughly 6 weeks. A pilot could not. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing experienced fighter pilots faster than any available training pipeline could realistically replenish them. The men who had built JG-52, JG-26, and JG-27 into legendary formations, pilots carrying 50, 100, 200 confirmed victories, the accumulated institutional knowledge of 3 sustained years of continuous air combat, were dying faster than the training system could absorb the loss, and as that pipeline choked under the pressure, training standards themselves collapsed in direct response. A new German pilot entering combat by late 1944 typically carried around 100 hours of total flight time. His American counterpart typically carried 400 hours or more, a substantial portion of it deliberately structured to replicate realistic combat conditions rather than simple basic airmanship. 100 hours teaches a pilot to take off, land, perform basic aerobatics, and hold formation. It does not prepare him for an actual fight, and these green German pilots were now being sent up to intercept formations of 800 B-17 escorted by 900 Mustangs, flown by American pilots who had, in many cases, been flying continuously since before the German replacement had even finished ground school. The result, in a great many documented cases, was not combat in any meaningful sense. It was closer to straightforward execution. Kurt Bühligen, one of the highest-scoring German aces on the Western Front with 112 confirmed victories, later described watching successive waves of replacement pilots arrive and disappear in rapid succession, many of them dead before they had truly learned what mistake had killed them. The surviving aces endured because they carried the accumulated skill, judgment, and instinct of hundreds of individual engagements. The replacements arriving behind them carried none of that inheritance, and died in ones and twos on nearly every mission, each individual loss further degrading the unit's own diminishing capacity to properly train whichever replacement arrived next. Systems analysts have a name for exactly this pattern, a death spiral. Worse pilot quality produces a higher loss rate. A higher loss rate compresses the training pipeline further. A shorter pipeline produces still worse pilot quality, the cycle closing in on itself with each successive rotation, while American Mustangs kept arriving at more than 100 a week, each one mechanically identical to the last, each one reliable, each one capable of remaining in the fight for 7 full hours. This is precisely the finding Wolfram's evaluation had forced into the open months earlier, stated in language considerably more concrete than an abstract discussion of flight endurance. A Mustang pilot who found himself in a badly disadvantageous position, low on energy, at the wrong altitude, outnumbered in a given local engagement, could simply disengage. He had the fuel remaining to climb back to altitude, reposition, wait, and return once the local balance had shifted back in his favor. A Bf-109 pilot with 90 minutes of total fuel carried no equivalent option. His clock was always running, and once it expired, he either turned for home or he died in the attempt to keep fighting past it. There was no meaningful third choice available to him. The Bf-109 remained in its own right an excellent aircraft. Wolfram himself flew it for 14 consecutive months on the Eastern Front and scored his entire 100-victory total in it, and in the hands of pilots of the caliber of Wolfram, Rall, or Hartmann, it remained more than adequate for fighting a determined war. But it had been designed, at its conceptual core, for a different kind of war entirely. One built around quick scrambles from a home airfield, short engagements fought over familiar local terrain, a rapid return to base, a point defense interceptor optimized specifically to defend the homeland against an attacker who could not, by simple physical necessity, remain over German territory for long. The P-51 had been built for the war that was actually being fought by 1944, one in which the attacker departed from an airfield in England, fought over Berlin itself, and still carried enough remaining fuel to strafe a German airfield on the return leg home. On July 16, 1944, the same day he claimed 10 confirmed victories northeast of Lviv, Wolfram was severely wounded, taken out of combat for months. He recovered eventually. The war he returned to was no longer the war he had left behind him. Wolfram returned to the front in February 1945, taking command of the 1st Staffel of JG-52 at 21 years old, carrying 100 confirmed victories, the Knight's Cross, and the accumulated survival of 4 separate combat wounds, precisely the kind of experienced pilot the Reich most urgently needed by that point in the war. What he found on returning was not the unit he remembered. The pilots were young. Most of them were visibly frightened. Not the ordinary useful fear that sharpens a combat pilot's awareness, but the paralyzing variety that comes from a man's own clear sense that he is simply not adequately trained for what is about to happen to him. Aircraft sat fully armed and mechanically airworthy on German airfields with nothing to put in their fuel tanks. The Allied strategic bombing campaign's targeting of German synthetic fuel production, the oil plan Allied planners had pushed through over considerable internal objection, was by this stage working exactly as intended. Both fronts were collapsing simultaneously. JG-52 relocated repeatedly across the war's final months as one airfield after another fell. The unit that had claimed more confirmed aerial victories than any fighter formation in the recorded history of aviation, reduced to searching for any remaining strip of functional runway still nominally held by German forces. On May 8, 1945, Wolfram's unit was at an airfield in Czechoslovakia when German forces formally surrendered. His group laid down its arms directly to American troops. 3 weeks later, in one of the bleaker administrative transactions recorded from this period of the war, the entire remaining prisoner population of JG-52 was transferred into Soviet custody. Wolfram himself was released relatively quickly. His accumulated combat wounds were severe enough that Soviet processing officers classified him as medically unfit for continued detention. Many of his surviving comrades were considerably less fortunate. A substantial number would not return from Soviet captivity for close to a decade, and some never returned at all. Günther Rall, who had flown the same captured Mustangs and understood precisely what they represented, was captured instead by American forces in Bavaria, released, worked briefly as a civilian, and in 1956 was invited back into uniform as one of the founding officers of the newly formed West German Bundesluftwaffe. He rose to lieutenant general, served as inspector of the German Air Force from 1971 to 1974, and completed his career as West Germany's representative to the NATO Military Committee before retiring in 1975. He died on October 4, 2009, at 91 in Bad Weichenhall. Wolfram could not stay away from flying. He became a competitive aerobatics pilot in civilian life, a man who had spent 14 months of his youth fighting for his own survival, now flying purely for its own sake, and won the West German National Aerobatics Championship in 1962, placing second in 1961, 1963, 1964, and 1966. He died on August 26, 2010, at 87, in Schwabach, the same Bavarian region where he had been born. Both men lived long enough to speak openly, in later decades, about exactly what they had found sitting inside those captured cockpits, and neither retreated into false modesty about it. They were professionals, rendering an honest assessment of a professional adversary's equipment, and their conclusions were consistent across every interview either man gave. Rall's own final word on the Mustang, delivered decades after the war had ended, held that it was, in his considered judgment, the best fighter aircraft of the entire conflict, not because of any single measurable performance statistic, but specifically because of its endurance, a gap he identified without qualification as the single decisive factor of the whole air war. Here is the forensic verdict. The Luftwaffe did not lose the air war over Europe for any shortage of individual courage. German fighter pilots ranked, by the testimony of their own enemies as much as by their own combat records, among the finest the discipline of aerial combat has ever produced. The training and combat system that shaped Wolfram, Rall, Hartmann, and Barkhorn was an extraordinary pilot development machine, forged directly in continuous combat from 1939 onward, and refined by operational experience no peacetime training program could plausibly replicate. What actually broke the Luftwaffe was that the P-51 Mustang changed the fundamental economics of the entire air campaign. Before its arrival in numbers, unescorted strategic bombing was genuinely bleeding the American 8th Air Force close to unsustainable levels. Schweinfurt had already demonstrated, in blunt statistical terms, that unescorted daylight raids over Germany could not continue indefinitely at their existing loss rates. The Luftwaffe's own strategy of waiting patiently beyond the American escort line was, on its own narrow terms, genuinely working, and given sufficient additional time, might plausibly have forced an abandonment of the entire daylight bombing campaign. Germany had not won the air war outright by mid-1943. It had, at minimum, found a credible way to make eventual American victory cost more than American political and military leadership might ultimately have been willing to pay. The Mustang rendered that entire calculation obsolete within a matter of months. It erased the escort line outright. It made every corner of the Reich's industrial heartland reachable on any given day of acceptable flying weather. It gave Doolittle's fighter pilots the fuel reserve to hunt rather than merely guard, and because American factories were producing them at a rate exceeding 100 a week, each one reliable, each one mechanically consistent, each one starting reliably at the press of a single switch, the supply proved effectively inexhaustible relative to Germany's actual capacity to destroy them in the air. Wolfram's own evaluation confirmed all of this in the plain, unadorned language of a working frontline fighter pilot, rather than in production statistics or strategic theory, in the plain language of what a man actually feels the instant he pushes a throttle forward and the engine simply does precisely what it is supposed to do every single time. A fine airplane. 3 words, from a pilot with 100 confirmed victories who had been shot down, crash-landed repeatedly, wounded 4 times, and kept flying regardless. 3 words that carried, in total, the entire verdict of the air war over Europe. The Mustang was never the sole reason the Luftwaffe ultimately collapsed. The Allied oil campaign devastated German fuel production directly. Sustained pilot attrition destroyed institutional combat knowledge no training pipeline could rebuild quickly enough to matter. Strategic bombing more broadly degraded German industrial output, even on the occasions it missed its intended targets. All of these separate forces converged across 1944 into a collapse that was, by any honest assessment, comprehensive and effectively irreversible. But the Mustang was the one instrument that made every other contributing factor decisive rather than merely damaging. It converted the bomber offensive from a survivable, if costly, pressure on German industry into an unsurvivable mathematical certainty. It converted Doolittle's fighter pilots from bomber escorts into hunters in their own right, and it forced Germany's own finest aces, Wolfram, Rall, and the men who flew beside them, to file honest professional reports that their own superiors, by every available account, did not particularly want to read.